Stoke-on-Trent's a slightly different place to perhaps anywhere else, definitely in Britain, and pretty unique across Western Europe, I would suggest, being an amalgamation of former town centres on almost a linear scale, as opposed to the multinodal with a defined centre that most other cities have. So that's its physical description, if you like. But what that brings is this almost petty nationalism of locality. However, in some ways that's not really what we need to understand at this stage. I would go back to, if you went back to the early 20th century, then that would be definitely the case. And much of that has actually continued through to the 21st century. But what I'd like to direct you to initially is the 1972 Local Government Act. Now, the 1972 Local Government Act fundamentally set up the structure of local government in the UK today. In North Staffordshire, in Stoke-on-Trent specifically, it led to what was called at the time the loss of powers. And what this meant was that the city itself became amalgamated into Staffordshire, where it had always been an independent city for the preceding 70, maybe 100, maybe 150 years, but before it was formally amalgamated. This was the solution of the 1972 Local Government Act was opposed cross-party. It wasn't a partisan issue at all. Every local political party was opposed to the amalgamation into Staffordshire. This was reversed eventually in 1997, when the city became a unitary authority. But it's well worth remembering back to 1972, or the lead up to 1972, because that shows, one, it shows almost the pride of the city in being unique, and the pride of the local populace as well as the local politicians in wanting to retain a degree of economic independence. Now, the solution from the local politicians of all parties, of the county and the city, to this was to maintain the city's administration within the county. And this was done by building a joint office block, which is called Unity House, which had the offices of, particularly of highways and education and social services, the large spenders, if you like, of the county had two venues. One was in Stafford in the county town, as one would expect, and the other was in Stoke-on-Trent in Unity House. Unity House also had much of the administration of the residual, if you like, city council authority. The reason for speaking about this in this particular way is because one of the solutions that we're looking at today in the scheme is the Smithfield site, which was the site of Unity House. And so we go full circle from what was effectively a unitary authority back in the 60s and early 70s to the Unity House period from the 70s, 80s and 90s to the 21st century, where that site now is being reimagined as a central business district with, I think we're led to believe, 2,000 jobs on it. So that is a timeline, if you like, of how the various things in Stoke-on-Trent have affected some of the developments that are going on now. One thing, there is another myth, well, there is a myth around, there has been for a long time, that Stoke-on-Trent has been almost a monotheic Labour city. That isn't true and never has been true. The local media were particularly upset in 1997 on the new authority when Labour took all 60 seats. I say the local media, there's nobody else was really that upset, and it was 60-0. Previously, through most of the 70s and 80s, there were opposition parties of different sorts. Now, if you go prior to that, in the 1960s, there was a Tory independent majority on the City Council in a period of a particular political turmoil in the city. As far as I am aware, and it's long before my time, so I'm not talking from personal experience here, to do with some land dealings or whatever that the leadership of the Labour Party at the time were implicated in. Through into the 2000s, there were several initiatives, if you like, of the Labour government that were particularly unpopular in North Staffordshire. Specifically the academisation of schools and the imposition of elected mayors on large cities. These two had catastrophic effect upon the party in Stoke-on-Trent. Mass defections, localist parties of various hues, some portraying themselves as being more to the left of the Labour Party and some portraying themselves perhaps a bit more to the right of the Labour Party, but taking members and supporters and volunteers, more importantly, from the Labour Party. And that sort of led to where we are today, where the city is led by Tories for not the first time in living memory, but as somewhat of a shock to much of the political establishment and to the pleasure of the local media. So we've come a long way. The city has changed. Some of its demographics have changed. Some of its politics have changed. In the recent past, there was a large agitation, let's say, by the far right, initially in the guise of the British National Party, who had several seats, I think perhaps 8 at their height, mainly in the poorer eastern estates. With the demise of the British National Party, much of that support moved towards the UK Independence Party, who, although only ever reached 1 or 2 seats on the local authority, no doubt had an impact upon the Brexit vote, where Stoke-on-Trent was classified as being one of the highest Brexit voting areas within the UK. So we have this almost mélange of political expression in Stoke-on-Trent over the years. Where do we go? How does this lead us to what's likely to happen in the future, but also with regards to the regeneration and the redevelopment of our city, and the various solutions that the project's looking at. If you bear with me just a minute, I shall just get some water. Is that enough? Okay. Okay. That probably means I can stroll backwards and forwards in front of the screen a bit more. So, one thing that has been noticeable in the recent past is the way that we've seen various projects in Stoke-on-Trent. On the screen here you can see the Spode works, which was purchased by the City Council under Labour control, fundamentally using money from the sale of the former Victoria ground, which was sold to a local developer as part of the deal for, slightly the other way around, but the new football stadium for Stoke City. There was some capital receipt from that, and fundamentally at that time, Spode, the business, collapsed, and there was money put into that. Now, Spode's a very interesting case. It was the only pottery factory, and perhaps the only manufacturing facility of any sort that had continuously run on the same site since the 18th century. Same site, and that's quite unique. Unfortunately, when that collapsed, the business collapsed, we're left with a huge industrial heritage, a huge industrial archaeology that was an organic archaeology almost on the site, and that had to be retained. And so much work has gone on over the last 10, 15 years perhaps on the Spode site, and now it's becoming, belatedly but certainly becoming, quite a vibrant community of say craft practitioners, perhaps, arts and crafts on the site in various different forms. From I think a 99-year lease on a hotel, which is almost a craft hotel, a boutique hotel, to artist studios and small-scale manufacturing. So this really is a success, and unfortunately, because it is very much self-contained, few local people are fully aware of what is really a success. The importance for mentioning it is that has carried on across every administration of whatever political colour. I would suggest that means the first decision was correct. However, as administrations change, the other projects are seen in slightly different ways. So, I mentioned earlier about the new central business district based upon the former site of Unity House. This was hugely criticised by all opposition parties when the Labour Party suggested it. They criticised it on so many different levels, even down to the colour of the building. And of course, the local media loved this because it is quite cosmetic and fails to understand the deep underlying purpose of that development. The interesting thing, of course, is that now those previous critics are singing its praises, whilst they carry on doing exactly the same thing, with slight changes, but fundamentally the same thing. Developing out a site that had been painstakingly drawn together mainly from the Unity House site, but also from some of the neighbouring uses. And I think that is something that does run through the, say, checkered political history of Stoke-on-Trent, is that there is an understanding that if you say like the major or large scale policy platforms, if you like, do have resonance with the people who understand it, and therefore with the politicians who implement those positions. There could be other examples, but I think those two are the ones that really stand out, is Spode and the Central Business District. There's about to open on the Central Business District, led by 2 office developments that the City Council put up. There's housing now going on the site, apartment block, if you like, and a hotel, and there will be further development in the near future. The whole site is likely to be built out within, I suppose, the next 10 years, so a 15-year project, with, at this moment in time, it looks like 100% occupancy, which is quite impressive. The buildings are going up in phases, in stages. I've seen other projects, other redevelopments of this style around the UK and elsewhere in Europe. Particularly seen one in Wigan, where superficially very successful in that the buildings are built, but the buildings aren't all full, and I think that is one of the challenges. But it does appear, because of the method of development in Stoke-on-Trent, that buildings will be built only to be full. I think that's got to be applauded. So looking to the future, there are many other challenging sites, but I believe that if the almost unwritten multi-partisan approach to redevelopment continues, which there's no reason to believe it shouldn't, then some of the dereliction that really does depress people in the population can be solved. I think the biggest threat in the future will be the viability of the City Council itself. It has been mooted by people from outside the city, particularly individuals within the county structure, that perhaps we should go back to a 1972 model where the city merges into the county, and that would be a more sustainable way forward for Stoke-on-Trent. I believe if that is mooted in a public way, I think there will be an outcry throughout the city. Around the UK at the moment, there are different models of local government being tested. One of the earliest was the amalgamation of I think 5 or 6 local authorities in Shropshire into one local authority. North Shropshire, Oswestry, Bridge North, South Shropshire, Shrewsbury, and the county itself became one authority. You see the same in, I think it's in Northamptonshire, where it's going to West Northamptonshire and North Northamptonshire. What a wonderful name that would be, North Northamptonshire. I believe it's Northamptonshire. And these models are changing all the time. If you look back to the papers that preceded the 1972 Local Government Act, one of those talked about the creation of a North Staffordshire Authority based upon the travel to work area. Now, some of us have always believed in that because it is a natural zone, if you like. It would stretch from Old Sager in Cheshire through to Uttoxeter in East Staffordshire, and include perhaps Stone in Mid Staffordshire and towards Market Drayton in Shropshire. This would be a huge area, but it would be a natural area of government. And I think that if there is any movement in the future towards reorganisation of local government in North Staffordshire and Stoke-on-Trent, then that must be the way forward, or at least that must be considered alongside other things. I don't believe it will happen, because I still believe that the almost like the unusual, and I do believe it's unusual, the unusual pride in their individual towns within the city makes then defending the city as being a boundary and a step too far for the city to be anything other than what it stands at the moment. Almost to conclude is to say that this, I mentioned, I called it earlier, petty nationalism within the extreme localism of people in Stoke-on-Trent and of politicians as well. I've been sat in meetings where one politician will talk about how this affects Burslem. It affects Burslem, it affects Burslem, it affects Burslem. Another politician in the same room, from the same political party, will be saying, this affects Mere, this affects Mere, this affects Mere. And that can be something that's really divisive, but it can be something that's really strengthening as well. I know that myself and my neighbours would seldom visit Tunstall unless we had a purpose to. It is about 5 kilometres, 6 kilometres away. Why would we go there? There is no reason to go. I have what I want either on my doorstep or within 3 or 4 kilometres either side. For shopping, for leisure, for sports, for finance, for politics even. People don't travel a long way. People look for work very much like in the 19th century when they lived next to the factory. People find work in their localities. Of course, some don't, so some travel. And one of my neighbours has worked in Birmingham and Warwickshire for 20 years. But he is the exception that proves the rule, I would suggest. So this almost microeconomies around the city makes it very, very, I believe, builds the resilience in many ways of the city. And so therefore, going forward, as this is towards the conclusion of what I wish to say, the microeconomies of the city actually build the city and make the city a resilient city in its own right. And I think there's very little likelihood of that changing in the near future. And I think I'll leave it there as a conclusion. because I think that it's. I think other people could take different conclusions from what I've said, but I think that that's fundamentally what people in Stoke-on-Trent would say. Thank you.